Hello everybody and welcome back. So my brother is one of those very fortunate people who have a birthday during this quarantine. So I am going to be making him a cake. Every year I've gotten him an ice cream cake from Dairy Queen for almost 10 years now. It started with his 16th birthday. But unfortunately, I guess Dairy Queen isn't really doing that right now. Long story short, I'm making him a cake. Last year, I made my dad this really decadent, rich chocolate cake with really delicious frosting that I made from scratch. Everybody loved it, so I'm gonna make it again. And I'm gonna teach you guys how to decorate a cake with nothing but an offset spatula and one piping tip. So let's get to it. Many of the recipes that I do on this channel are very simple and don't require a lot of equipment or any strange ingredients, but today we're making a super decadent cake that is certainly a treat and that you wouldn't make all the time. So there are some ingredients that are a little bit more tricky to find possibly, but there are easy substitutions for them if you can't find them. I am going all out and using probably the most expensive ingredients here. Don't have to do that, but it's just that it's a birthday cake, it's a special occasion, and I'm happy and capable, thank goodness, to be able to do that for my family. The ingredients for our cake today will be 3 cups of flour, 2 cups of sugar, I'm using cane sugar, 2/3 cup of cocoa, I'm using a red-black mix, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2.5 teaspoons of baking soda. For the wet, you will need 1/3 cup of melted earth balance or something similar, 1/3 cup of coconut yogurt, 2 cups of milk. I will be using a mix of almond and macadamia nut milk, 1 tablespoon of black coffee, 1.5 teaspoons of apple cider vinegar, and either 1 tablespoon of vanilla extract or 1 teaspoon of the real stuff. For our frosting, you will need 1 cup of vegetable shortening, 1 cup of earth balance, 4 tablespoons of some kind of milk beverage. I'm going to be using almond milk, 4 teaspoons of vanilla extract, 1 teaspoon of caramel extract, and 12 plus cups of powdered sugar. The equipment you will need to make and bake the cake will be a bowl, a measuring cup to melt the butter, a 2-cup or larger measuring cup for your milk, a spatula, a sifter is preferred if you have one, some kind of apparatus to make coffee, and a 9-inch cake pan. I'm using one that has a bottom that comes out of it, which I find easier to work with. The equipment you will need for the frosting is just a bowl, a spatula, and a hand mixer. The equipment you will need to decorate the cake will be a small offset spatula, a piping bag. I have a reusable piping bag because I do this often. You can just use a plastic bag and cut a hole in the plastic bag, as well as a tip and a way to attach the tip to the bag. I'm using a small open star tip. That is my tip of preference. You can use whatever you'd like. I would recommend some kind of star tip though, because we are going to be doing little flower designs. You will also need a serrated knife to level the cake before decorating. I'm also going to be transporting the cake, so I need a box that is going where this all is going to fit together in order to bring the cake over to my brother and deliver it with social distancing safety. As a final touch for decorating, I'm also going to use these dark chocolate swirls that I got at Bulk Barn. They are fancy looking, but super cheap, and I like them a little bit better than sprinkles. Of course, you can also use sprinkles in a very similar way. The very first thing we're going to do is actually turn our milk into a buttermilk mixture. So I'm going to use 1 cup of macadamia nut milk, 1 cup of almond milk, and 1.5 teaspoons of apple cider vinegar. In a measuring cup, I'm going to whisk these together and set them aside and allow the milk to curdle. I would also highly recommend possibly using a hazelnut milk or a walnut milk. Any nut milk that is going to have a high fat content to it. That's going to make the cake nice and rich, and that's really what we want here. Of course, if you're making a cake for a group of people, I would probably recommend instead using a coconut milk, because it is a very high fat milk and it is probably the least offensive milk when it comes to allergens. So I would recommend using that both for the cake and for the rest of the recipe if you're making it for a large group. I know that my brother and his fiance are both not allergic to nuts, so all of these various nut milks that I'm using are because I can use them and I'm aware that I can use them. Otherwise, just be very careful when it comes to that. Then we're gonna move to our dry ingredients. So we're gonna add our flour, sugar, and salt. Give that a mix. And then we're gonna add the cocoa. Now I like to do the cocoa separately. I'm actually going to put an apron on because I think this is a really cute shirt and I don't want to ruin it. Cocoa can stain, so be very careful with it. So I'm going to use a red and black cocoa mix. Black cocoa is a very dark cocoa. It is very rich and works really well in this recipe. So next, I'm just going to sift the cocoa into the flour mix. Once you finish sifting your cocoa, give your dry ingredients a nice mix until everything is well combined. Should be this beautiful gray purpley color. Now the baking soda, we're actually going to wait until the end of the recipe to add it in, and it's going to help the cake become airy and fluffy. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make my coffee. Now I am using a very expensive coffee. Cheap coffee hurts my tummy. So I have Fair Trade Dark Roast Coffee, Fair Trade West Coast Dark Roast Coffee from Bulk Barn that I'm going to be using for this recipe. While the coffee is brewing, we're going to move back to making the batter. Into our dry mixture, we're going to create a well and add the wet mixture and gently fold it together. So the coffee's almost done. I'm gonna go ahead and preheat the oven now to 350. A little for the recipe and a little bit for me. That's good coffee. At this point, we wanna make sure that we're getting all of the flour at the bottom. So take your time and be very careful through this process because you really don't wanna overmix this. The final wet ingredient that we're going to add after the coffee is going to be our yogurt. Now this is going to really just up the moisture content in this cake. It is just so rich and delicious. I'm using a Silk brand vanilla unsweetened, but honestly most coconut yogurt brands are really good. I also really like the Yoso brand of yogurt, and if you're in Sudbury and you are lucky enough, Be Greater carries Deeb's coconut yogurt. Is this guy right here. I'll be honest, if it wasn't quarantine times, this is probably the stuff I would use. It's made in small batches and it is one of the thickest yogurts I have ever had the pleasure of enjoying. Okay, I think I got all the little flour bombs at the bottom now. It is nicely mixed together. Now the final thing we're going to do is add our baking soda. So what it's going to do is react with the apple cider vinegar. We're going to let that sit and just continue to do its chemically thing while the oven preheats and we get our pan ready. So putting the batter aside, and now we're going to pull out the pan and I am going to just grease it with shortening, as well as a little sprinkle of the red cocoa powder to just ensure that the cake does not stick. With the pan well greased and dusted with cocoa, I've put the batter into the pan and then we're going to put it into the oven for around 45 to 60 minutes. Once you put a knife in or a toothpick and it passes the toothpick test, which is, you put it in right in the middle and it comes out clean, that's when you know it's done, of course. And then I'm going to leave the cake to completely cool before I take the pan off of the cake, and then allow that to just sit overnight and come to a complete cool. When I get up in the morning, I'm going to put the cake in the freezer to really allow it to drop in temperature, and that makes it a lot easier to work with, especially a chocolate cake. It's much more likely to be crumbly, and especially when you're using a white icing on a chocolate cake, it can become difficult if the cake becomes like warm or room temperature. When it's just more spongy, it's a lot easier to work with when it's more like a rock. This is why I wore an apron. Good morning. We are back in day 2 of making the cake. So I usually like to let the cake just sit overnight. It's a lot less stressful than having baked it in the morning and then decorating in the afternoon. So the cake is all ready. I've been chilling it in the freezer for a little while. That's not necessarily a necessary step, but it is just something that I like to do to make it easier to work with. So you're gonna need a little cake plate. They look like this. You can get them grocery store, bulk barn. What this allows you to do is be able to like turn the cake on your countertop, and it's a lot easier to work with. Before we can decorate our cake, we have to make our frosting. The hardest part about frosting is making a huge mess. So you want to make sure you have a nice big bowl with high tops to be able to catch a lot of the icing sugar while you're mixing it. In that bowl, you are going to add your 1 cup of shortening and your 1 cup of earth balance and blend that together. Make sure you whip it really good and get all of the clumps out of the shortening. Once you've whipped it pretty good for about a minute, you're gonna add your milk. I'm using almond milk, and then whip it again for about a minute. Then we're going to add our extracts. Now, I originally did not use enough extract. In the end, I ended up using a full teaspoon of vanilla bean extract, a full teaspoon of caramel extract, and a tablespoon of regular vanilla extract. Now, you can add whatever extracts you like to this. Like, I would highly recommend almond extract, or perhaps a butter vanilla extract, or French vanilla, or butterscotch. Any of those would be really delicious in here, so by all means, have fun with it. And finally, once that's all combined and whipped together really well, you're going to add your icing sugar. Now, I didn't measure my icing sugar, but the measurement at the start is a good idea of how much you're going to need. Really, icing sugar is very much like flour and a yeasted dough. It changes all the time. So really, the more important thing is that you want to get to a certain consistency with the frosting before moving on and decorating the cake. So we're going to fold in the icing sugar to begin with, and then whip it to get rid of some clumps. Add a bit more, fold it in, whip it, and you're going to keep doing that until the icing sugar pulls away from your finger. However, in these times, you might want to use a spoon, and if you are tasting the extract, make sure that you are either washing that spoon or using a different spoon, of course. One difficult thing about tasting buttercream just by itself without the context of the cake is that it is really sweet and sometimes hard to tell the actual flavor, but you should want to eat it. So finally, we have our beautiful frosting that is nice and thick and ready to decorate the cake. One common mistake is making the frosting too thin, and then it ends up being very droopy on the cake. If you make it too thick, then it's going to be hard to smoothly spread it across the cake. Now we're going to move on to decorating the cake, and the first thing that you have to do before you can decorate the cake is cut off the cake top so that the cake is nice and level. So the next several instructions that I'm going to give you, Claire from Bon Appetit is the one who I learned most of this from. So along with this video, with these tips, you should definitely go watch Claire's video below on decorating cakes. It is basically most of my knowledge, as well as like my friends who are also bakers who gave me some fantastic tips. But in terms of leveling the cake, I use her technique. So you're going to go in on one side of the cake, so figure out like where the edge of the cake is that you want to level from. And it doesn't have to be exactly where that little edge is. You can go a little bit higher. It's okay if it's not completely at that little level and has a little bit of an edge, just so you're using a little bit more of the cake. So you take your chilled cake and you start in at one side, and then you go about a quarter way in, and then you start turning the cake. Okay, turn the cake and then dig it in a little bit more. Turn the cake a little bit more until you've pretty much done the entire outside of the cake and made a ring. And then you're going to gently, first of all, make sure it's actually level, so get down to that level and then gently cut it across to meet the sides that you've already cut. And it has worked for me every single time. I never end up with cakes that are not level, so highly recommend this technique. Now is a great time if you would like to try your cake top with your icing. It gives you a much better, more in context flavor than you would otherwise have just eating the very sugary icing. If you weren't happy, now is a great time to adjust your frosting before it actually gets onto the cake. The next step is going to be our crumb coat and chill. So you're going to take your piping bag and pipe on the frosting. So I highly recommend doing this instead of just dumping on the frosting. Now you can do either, honestly, it doesn't matter. But this is the technique that I use. It always works for me, and I end up with a really good crumb coat that's easy to work with afterward. So give it a squeeze, hold it where it's slightly pressing into the cake, but also just a little bit over top of the cake. And then I'm just doing large circles just to spread it across the cake. We're gonna do this all around the top of the cake and all down the side of the cake. So notice how I haven't covered the whole cake because this was pretty thick, and we're gonna thin it out a little bit with our offset spatula. Next thing you're gonna do is fill a tall cup with warm to hot water. And that is what our spatula, our offset spatula, is gonna sit in order to keep it nice and warm and work really well in spreading our frosting. And you're going to want a clean towel that you don't mind getting covered in shortening and earth balance, because some towels this can stain in some materials. So a towel you don't necessarily like but is very clean. We're going to use that towel to do the following process. Okay, offset spatula in the cup, wipe it off with the towel, spread, wipe it off on your bowl, wipe it off with the towel, and repeat. That's it. That's pretty much the technique that we're going to use to cover this entire cake. We're going to do that for a crumb coat, put it in the freezer, chill it, and then once you're able to touch it and it doesn't make any kind of imprint, then we are ready to do the proper coat. You want to get this thin coat on the top of it so you're able to see the cake. Get down there, look at the cake. Okay. Most important thing here is that you want everything to kind of be even and level so it doesn't have too many globby bits, loopy bits. Trying to get it just covering the whole cake, but even if there are gloopy bits, we're going to fix that anyway when we do the main coat. So like this part does not have to look pretty. It serves a practical function and thus only needs to be efficient. Okay, so I think I've done a pretty good job here. Now you can take your little clean towel and give it a wipe around the edges so that that stuff doesn't necessarily like freeze. It's not a big deal if it does, but if you can avoid it, great. So this is now going to go in the freezer, I'd say for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to it and do the proper top coat. Okay, so now you see I tap it, no imprint, she's ready to decorate. Okay, the glass of water that you had, the hot water, now that we've stepped away for a little while, replace it with fresh hot water. So now we're essentially going to do what we did before. Yeah, we're going to put on that thick layer of frosting. Load up. Wish I had a larger piping bag, but you know what? We're making do. It's quarantine times. Also, this is literally all I own. That's why we're doing this. So now, we're back to this. But what you're going to do, I'm just holding it up so you can kind of see. You're just going to kind of push out the little bit of air in the bottom until it makes that noise. Alright, I'm going to just start in the middle, and I'm going to more deliberately spread it around. So when your equipment is limited, the biggest thing you need is patience. Alright? This is going to look really good when we're done. I promise. You take your time and be very gentle and kind with yourself. Okay? Have some confidence in your ability. And while you're doing this part, if you are not used to decorating cakes, is a nice time to get used to how to hold the piping bag. Okay, so shimmy it in, grab at the top, push it down, twist. There's the poop. Okay, so now the air is out of it. Got a nice thick piping bag. This is small enough that I can use one hand, and even for my little baby hands, it's okay. So this doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to even it out with the spatula. You can get, if you want to use a little bit of moisture on it, that's going to get you this nice flat layer. Okay, now don't worry too much about the top. I know I spread the top out mostly to get as much to the edges as possible. But now we're actually going to work on the edges. before coming back to the top. I have a bit of an angle here, okay, and I'm coming across and I'm gently scraping off a little bit of frosting while also flattening. Again, this takes time and patience, and just getting used to a certain pressure to put on the side of the cake. And this process is repetitive. Like, this part takes a while. The actual, like, doing the little rosettes and stuff and decorating, that part is quick. This is the tough stuff. We are going to do a small outer edge around the outside of this cake, so don't worry too much about how the edge kind of touches the cake plate. We're going to cover that up. Alright, this is actually looking pretty good here. We actually don't want to get the side perfect until the top then matches the sides, because you're going to start messing with it and going back and forth once the top is finished, so then we'll worry about it getting the perfectly smooth layer. The goal here was to just make sure that we had an even layer. So all the stuff that was pushed up while we were messing with it, that's what we're evening out now. Doing this kind of up and over technique. Nice clean spatula. I'm going to dip it again, give it a little tap, and we're going to start using the wet spatula to smooth it out. Now remember, we're covering most of this cake with rosettes and either sprinkles or chocolate, so this doesn't have to be perfect. That's what makes this kind of cake beautiful. It takes away a lot of the pressure from getting the perfect lines. Smooth it out a little bit. Now you got to go around the top again. This part you want long strokes so that it's as even as possible. And now any last adjustments you'd like to make before we chill this. Now know, after this is chilled, you can still make adjustments, and we are actually going to go over it once it's chilled. We're going to go over it again with a hot spatula, and that's going to even out anything else that we weren't able to get in this process. Give it a wipe, and we're going to put it back into the freezer for another like 10 minutes. Again, we want to be able to touch it without things moving, because decorating the cake is going to be a lot easier if it's nice and chilled, and we don't have to worry about ruining our base layer. So, when you purchase your tip, I highly recommend purchasing a large tip rather than a little puny BB tip. Okay? With the large tip, you're going to have more control, and it's going to make a shape that is far more desirable. Okay? So, round, swoop. This is what I'm going to mostly use on the top of the cake. So these are going to be my larger ones, and these are going to be my slightly smaller ones. So for the poopy, start in the middle, go around once, start to come up, press into your first layer, and then slowly release, and then do a little squeeze at the top. So here we've got our nice chilled cake, my warm water, a nice clean warm spatula here, and we're going to smooth out those little ridges. Okay. I am pretty satisfied with this. An important lesson here is, of course, it's okay that it's not absolutely perfect. Okay, your level of perfect is going to increase the more times you practice this. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it's important to be kind to yourself here. Okay, and know when enough is enough, and when you need to put down the piping tip. Alright, so on our least high side, okay, I actually like cut this pretty good. I would say that if I was going to pick, that this side here would be ever so slightly lower, and that's the side I'm going to start my decoration. So I'm decorating this asymmetrically, which again relieves a lot of pressure off of yourself when it comes to decorating a cake. So this is, when I'm looking at it, my 9 o'clock. I'm going to start here, a good ways in. This is going to be the big rosette. Now I'm going to do 2 poopy rosettes right beside it. It's just under the same size, touching my first rosette. Now I'm going to do the swirly rosette again, ever so slightly smaller, then the poopy rosette again, Alright, and I'm going to do my final 2 swirls here. Slightly smaller swirls. Swirls get harder and harder as you get smaller. There we go. Now the rest here are going to be little poopies that are the same size. And there we go. Wow, look at that. I didn't redo any of them because you know what? In the grander scheme of things, nobody's going to look at one rosette by itself and be like, oh, that one's fucking ugly. Nobody's doing that but you. Okay? I'm going to put little dabs. These are going to fill in the gaps and also make it pretty cute. So I'm just going to kind of keep doing that around the cake where I feel like the cake could use a little bit more something. Let's refill the piping bag. It's good to do the bottom border just in one fell swoop. So you want to pick the back of your cake. Now, again, this is 9 o'clock for me. So the back of my cake is going to be 12 o'clock, where I would be taking pictures from the front here. So I'm actually going to turn the cake, okay, and we're going to do this push, lift, push, lift, push, lift on an angle. I'm doing little squeezy lifts, little squeezy lift. So this looks really good. It was not hard. It's literally just squeeze, pull, squeeze, pull, squeeze, pull. It's like little pulses with my hand. While the frosting is still warm and sticky, we are going to take our little decorations here and put them on top. You're just going to gently salt bay this. Quite frankly, writing on cake is overrated. I think this is so much prettier. Every cake maker out there, I can promise you, hates you for getting writing on your cake. Just dropping truth bombs. Who cares? Just get a card. So I'm just gently gonna kind of place them around the bottom base here. And there we go. Into the freezer she goes. I'm gonna take a picture. It looks so cute. Alright, into the freezer, and then I'm gonna take some sexy shots, and we're gonna box this guy up, and I'm finally going to go deliver it to my brother for his birthday. Cake's packed up. I've got Dustin's little birthday card, and I'm ready to go.